I would like to review electrolysis and how to choose the equations that go along with different parts of electrolysis. So the first part of this, we need to talk about the electrodes, which in this case are going to be our pencils, and that's whatever the electrical wire that touches our solution. So the electrodes in this case, we just have to figure out what's going to happen if we have a positive and negative electrode, what makes them positive and negative, and what kind of reaction is going to occur next to those two. And that's pretty easy. The second part is if you have a solution that has ions, and it has to have ions or else they're not going to conduct electricity, then how are those ions going to migrate to the different electrodes? And that's again very easy because positive electrodes go to the negative wire and negative electrodes go to the positive wire. Lastly, we have to know how to choose the equations, and we're going to have two different lists. We use one list to choose the reaction that occurs at the negative electrode, and we have another list to choose which equation happens at the positive electrode, and then we just put it all together. Now, we had our pencil apparatus, and here's a schematic, and the idea here is if the negative side of the battery is going to pump electrons into our pencil. So this pencil here, the one that's connected to the negative side, is going to have all kinds of extra electrons on the tip of this where the battery has pumped electrons into it. So whoever's going to touch that negatively charged piece of graphite is going to gain electrons, and we know that if you gain electrons, Leo the lion says grr. If you gain electrons, that's reduction. So reduction is definitely going to occur at the negative electrode. And in the same way, electrons, the pump here is going to get those electrons from somewhere, so the electrons are being pumped out of the other pencil. So the pencil here that ends up with a positive charge, then whatever touches that is going to lose electrons, and if you lose electrons, that's oxidation. So it would be good if you could kind of memorize the idea, but if this is negatively charged, there's too many electrons, and whatever is going to be there is going to gain electrons. That's reduction. And if it's reduction, we call that the cathode. And in the same way, whoever has the positive charge, whoever's connected to the positive side of the battery, then the electrons have been pumped out of that pencil. So when a chemical touches it, it's going to lose electrons. That's oxidation. So this one is going to be called the anode. So the anode is the positive wire, and the cathode is the negative wire for electrolysis. So if we have our situation, let's say we're going to do electrolysis with a solution of sodium sulfate, then obviously sodium sulfate has sodium ions and it has sulfate ions. So if you were a positive sodium ion, it wouldn't be surprising to anybody that you would end up over here at the negative electrode, because opposite charges attract each other, so positive ion would go to the negative electrode. And it's the same way over here at the positive electrode, that's where the negative ions are going to be, and in this case it's going to be sulfate. So the positive ions go to the negative side, negative ions go to the positive side, and that's what completes the circuit and allows a reaction to happen. Now, besides the ions over here, then there's definitely water in contact with that wire. So the reaction is either going to be sodium ion changing or the water changing. And on the positive wire, it's either going to be sulfate ions changing or water that's changing. So water is always one of our choices. Now to figure out what's really going to happen, then we have to go back to a chart. So if we have a negative wire and we got a positive wire, we said the negative wire, the substances are going to gain electrons, that's reduction. So we're going to use this chart for the negative wire, and we're going to have oxidation. We're going to use this chart for the positive electrode. So the negative electrode, chemicals are going to gain electrons, and that's the cathode. So negative goes along with the reduction. And now we said at the negative side, positive ions go there, So here's positive ions. So that's one possible reaction. But also water's there, so we've got to find the reaction for water gaining electrons. So these are the two equations that we want to consider. And those are the two numbers we're going to use to decide. Okay, all these other ones, we see water here. We don't care because water is, on the right side. We need water on the left side. And we see water here. Okay, so we just don't care about those reactions. We want the reaction where water is gaining electrons or sodium ions are gaining electrons. Those are our two choices. And of those two, we can see whichever one has the larger value is the more likely to be reduced. So that's the equation. So the sodium is not involved in this reaction. It's just going to float around. And the water is actually the one that changes. So if somebody says, well, what is the reaction that's going to occur? All you have to do is copy down this reaction, the more likely of the two, and ignore everything else. So water is going to pick up electrons. We're going to be making hydrogen gas. So we should see some bubbles. And we're going to be making hydroxide ions. Now hydroxide ions, if there is a indicator in the solution, like we have the universal indicator, okay, hydroxide ions, that causes the solution to turn purple. So if we go back and look, okay, this side over here at the negative side, because the water is changing, you can see that we get the color, we get all that purple color. That's due to the hydroxide ions. Now the other side is turning red, and that's because they're hydrogen ions, and we'll see that in a minute. So hydroxide ions are formed, and that makes the solution purple. Now in the same way, if we go to the positive electrode, now the positive electrode is positive because we pulled out electrons with the battery. So whatever chemical touches is going to lose electrons, and that's called oxidation. So to figure out what's going to happen, we have to go to the oxidation potential chart. So negative side, look at reduction. Positive side, look at oxidation. Okay, otherwise you get all messed up. So looking here, we're going to go through and pick out a couple of chemicals. So we have sulfate and we have water. Now water is everywhere, but sulfate is the negative ion that was be attracted to the positive electrode. So we're going to find a reaction where water is on the left. So that's this one. So water can get oxidized. And we'll notice that sulfate is not anywhere on the left side. It's over here, but that doesn't count because that's on the right side of the arrow. We need somewhere where we have sulfate over here on the left side of the arrow, and there just isn't any place where it is, and that's because you want to oxidize. That kind of means gain some more oxygen. And sulfate, that has many oxygens as it can hold. Sulfur can only get 4 oxygens. There's no super sulfate with 5 or 6 oxygens. So this one is not going to change. In fact, that's why we chose that chemical, because we wanted to make sure that the water changed, not the sulfate. So in this case, we don't even have a choice to make. All we have to do is look at this reaction and say it has to be water that gets oxidized, and this is the chemical reaction. And we're going to make oxygen gas, and we're going to make hydrogen ions. And the hydrogen ions, back to our picture, hydrogen ions is what causes this solution to be red, because that's the acid-base indicator, and that's the acid side. And if we look really closely, there are some bubbles forming right there on the wire. So we get the bubbles on this side, and we get color change for the acid. So if we put all that together, what's the overall reaction? Is water is being reduced, and we get hydrogen gas, and we get hydroxide at one side, and water is being oxidized, we get oxygen gas, and we get hydrogen ions at the other side. Now, another whole situation, here's potassium iodide. So we know that water could possibly come over to this side. At the positive side, water could be over at the negative side because water is everywhere. But K plus and I minus, we know that the K plus will come over to the negative side, and the I minus will come over to the positive side. So now when we do our reactions, we just have to figure out which of these two possibilities are going to change. So let's do the negative side. At the negative side, we have reduction, and we have K plus and we have water. So here's the possibility for K plus and water right over here above it. So water can change, potassium can change, and we ignore all the other reactions. And of those two, it's going to be the water that changes. So we can copy that reaction. So water is going to pick up a couple of electrons. And what happens, it forms hydrogen gas, and it forms two hydroxides. Now, this side over here, the hydroxides are what causes the phenolphthalein to turn hot pink. And if we look really closely, there's some hydrogen gas bubbles, over here around the pencil. It's the same way over here. We have a possibility of iodide could change at the positive one, or water can change. So water losing electrons, that's this bottom reaction. And iodine changing is this reaction. And the way I've drawn that is really hard to see, but you understand. And we ignore all the other reactions. We need to have water on the left side losing electrons. So the fact that there's water in that one, that doesn't help us because it's got SO2. The fact it's water in that one, it's on the right side. We don't care about that. We just want to find water that is losing electrons. And of those two, which is more likely, the one with a larger number? So in this case, it's the iodine that's changing. So let's copy that down. 2I minus turns into I2 plus 2 electrons, and I'm just copying this off the chart. So this is going to be the overall reaction. We'll put these together. Let's change colors. So everything on the left turns into everything on the right. So first off, 2 electrons, we'll cancel that out. And so what do we have left? 2 waters plus 2 iodide ions are going to turn into hydrogen gas and 2 hydroxides and I2. Now, there were little teeny bubbles of hydrogen. There was a pink color because of the hydroxide, and the iodine, it forms on the surface, and if you look really, really closely, there are tiny little crystals of iodine on the end of the pencil, but they also dissolve a little bit into the water, and that's where we get this orange color. So I'm going to see if I can zoom in on this just a little bit. So I'll clear the ink. And I'm going to take this picture and zoom it in. And I don't know if you can see that, but on the surface, over here at the positive side, we have all this little iodine that forms. And the iodine that forms makes the solution yellow. And this yellow really is the I3 minus ion, but that's a little beyond what we're talking about. So at the positive side, we get iodine forming. We can tell that from our two charts. And that's the whole situation. So for each situation, you say, okay, at the negative side, we want to look at the reduction chart and pick out the positive ion would be attracted to the negative side, and water is also a possibility. So in this case, water is the more likely reaction. And then if we go to the positive electrode, okay, we want to look at the oxidation chart. Okay, again, water is a possibility, but whatever the negative ion is in the solution is also a possibility. And in this case, iodine was more likely to change. So the iodine changed for here, the water changed for there, and we put the reaction together. And that's how electrolysis works. So just to review, the positive and negative electrodes are going to become the places where oxidation reduction occurs. At the negative side, you are going to get reduction, and at the positive electrode, you're going to get oxidation. The ions are going to go toward the oppositely charged electrode, and then we have to choose the electrons. At the negative side, we want to look at the reduction chart, and at the positive side, we want to look at the oxidation chart, and pick out whichever reaction has a larger voltage. Good luck.